Somewhere in a family tree search, a person types in a surname like Kaiser, or Koenig, or Graf, and for one instant, allows themselves to believe something enormous. That the name is not just a name, that it is a leftover fragment of a crown. Emperor, king, these are not ordinary words to build a surname from. And for centuries, families carrying them have quietly wondered the same thing. Does this name mean what it sounds like it means? Is there a bloodline hiding underneath it, a thread running back to an actual court, an actual title, an actual seat of imperial power? The honest answer is more interesting than a simple yes, and more interesting than a simple no. Because when historians and geneticists actually went looking through parish registers, feudal tax rolls, and the patrilineal signal preserved in the Y chromosome, what they found was not a clean story of hidden nobility. It was something stranger. A set of names that sat, generation after generation, closer to power than almost any other surnames in the German-speaking world. Not because their bearers wore the crown, but because of exactly what they were doing standing next to it. This is the story of 12 surnames that map, with unusual precision, onto the administrative skeleton of the old Holy Roman Empire, and what genetic and historical research actually suggests about the families who carried them. For a long time, the accepted explanation for names like these was almost embarrassingly literal. Genealogists in the 19th and early 20th centuries, working with limited records and a fondness for tidy narratives, often assumed that a surname meaning king, or count, or bishop must trace back to an actual member of that class. A minor royal, a fallen aristocrat, a nobleman's illegitimate line quietly folded into commoner life. It made intuitive sense. Names were assumed to describe their bearer directly, the same way Miller meant your ancestor milled grain, or Schmidt meant your ancestor forged iron. Kaiser, by that logic, meant your ancestor was somehow an emperor, or at least descended from one. That explanation held for a long time, mostly because almost nobody had the tools to test it. The first crack appeared exactly where you would expect it, in the sheer number of people carrying these names. If every Kaiser, Koenig, and Graf in Central Europe descended from actual emperors, kings, and counts, the Holy Roman Empire would have needed a nobility roughly the size of a modern city, which it very much did not have. Actual titled nobility across German-speaking lands, at any given point in the medieval and early modern period, numbered in the low thousands. The surnames descended from those titles number in the hundreds of thousands. Something did not add up. And once historians started reading medieval naming customs more carefully, they realized the mismatch was not a mistake in the records. It was a mistake in the assumption. Naming practices in medieval and early modern German-speaking Europe were not primarily about biological descent. They were about proximity, role, and reputation. A name could describe what a person actually was, or it could describe what a person did in relation to someone far more powerful than themselves. That distinction turns out to be almost everything. This is where genetics enters the story, not as a verdict, but as a second, independent line of evidence layered on top of the historical record. Researchers studying surname inheritance in patrilineal naming cultures, where a surname passes from father to son in the same pattern as the Y chromosome, have found that men sharing a surname are, on average, more likely to share a related Y chromosome signature than men chosen at random from the general population. The effect is strongest for rarer surnames with a narrow point of origin, and weaker for common occupational names adopted independently by many unrelated families. What this means, practically, is that a surname is not simply decorative. In many cases it does trace a real, if imperfect, paternal line signal stretching back centuries. But, and this is the part that changes the entire story, a shared surname signal traces you back to whoever first adopted that name for whatever reason they adopted it. Not necessarily to a king. Sometimes to a servant standing 3 feet away from one. That is not a disappointment. It is the actual twist. Take the surname Kaiser itself. Historical record after historical record shows the name emerging not from imperial bloodlines, but from 3 very different, very human sources. Some families received it as a nickname because an ancestor played the role of the emperor in a local pageant or religious procession. Medieval communities loved theatrical roleplay, and the label sometimes stuck for generations. Others carried it because an ancestor held land directly under imperial jurisdiction as a tenant of the emperor's own estates, rather than the estates of a regional duke or bishop, a legal distinction that mattered enormously in a fragmented empire. And a smaller number traced to families who worked in some capacity within an actual imperial household, administratively or domestically. None of those origins involve inherited royal blood. All three involve genuine, documented closeness to the machinery of imperial power. Koenig follows a comparable pattern. Rather than descending from actual kings, many families carrying this name either played a symbolic king role in local festivals, including harvest ceremonies and shooting competitions that crowned a temporary king for the year, or lived on land historically designated as royal or crown territory, distinguishing them from tenants of ordinary local lords. If names like these are starting to feel less like nobility and more like a map of medieval bureaucracy, that is exactly where this is heading, and it only gets more specific from here. Graf, meaning count, and Herzog, meaning duke, present a slightly different case, because unlike Kaiser or Koenig, these titles corresponded to actual functioning offices with real administrative territory attached. A count was not a ceremonial fiction. He governed a county, collected taxes, administered justice, and answered, at least nominally, to a higher authority. Families carrying the surname Graf or Herzog overwhelmingly descend not from the counts and dukes themselves, whose legitimate lines are extensively documented and traceable through separate, dedicated noble genealogies, but from households and estates that existed in direct service to those offices, stewards, court officials, and tenants whose entire identity became defined by which count or duke they served. Ritter, meaning knight, might seem like the most literal of the group, and in the smallest number of cases, it is. Some families do descend from genuine knightly lines. But historical linguists have shown that Ritter also spread widely as an occupational or aspirational surname among free tenant farmers and soldiers who served under a knight's banner without holding the title themselves, and among families who simply adopted the name as a mark of ambition during the surname standardization period of the late Middle Ages. Voigt, Bischoff, Kammerer, Marshal, Schultheiss, Freiherr, and Junker complete the picture, and each tightens the connection between name and function rather than name and blood. A Voigt was an appointed administrator who represented the interests of a distant noble or imperial authority in a local territory, often the single most powerful local figure most ordinary medieval people would ever interact with directly. Bischoff marks families connected to the household, tenancy, or administrative service of a bishop, in regions where the church itself functioned as a territorial power. Kammerer and Marshal trace to specific court offices, the chamberlain who managed a noble household's finances and access, and the marshal who oversaw horses, logistics, and often military organization, positions of genuine daily proximity to power, even without noble blood. Schultheiss marks families whose ancestors held a chartered magistrate's office under imperial or noble authority, responsible for local law and tax collection. And Freiherr and Junker, somewhat differently, mark families descended from the lower tiers of actual landed nobility, untitled or minor, but genuinely part of the aristocratic class, distinguishing them from the 12 names more common administrative pattern. That distinction matters enormously because it means this is not a story where every name means the same thing. It is a layered map, some names marking genuine minor nobility, most marking the vast administrative class that made imperial governance physically possible, and a handful marking pure symbolic borrowing from festivals and pageantry. The landmark shift in understanding this came less from a single spectacular discovery and more from the patient cross-referencing of two enormous, independent datasets, medieval tax and land records documenting who actually held which offices and tenancies across German-speaking territories, and modern Y-chromosome surname studies tracking which surname-sharing men are genetically related along the paternal line and which are not. When historians laid these datasets over each other, the administrative explanation held up far better than the inherited nobility explanation for the overwhelming majority of the 12 names studied here. So the twist is not that these families are secretly descended from emperors. The twist is something more specific, and in its own way more remarkable. These names encode centuries of documented proximity to the exact machinery that ran an empire, the tax collectors, the estate stewards, the chartered magistrates, the household chamberlains, a class of families who were not royal, but who were, generation after generation, standing in the room where imperial power actually operated. If that kind of layered, evidence-based family history interests you, this is the sort of trail worth following in your own name. Because the real story hiding behind an old surname is almost always more specific and more human than the folklore version. Why does any of this matter beyond one country's surname list? Because it illustrates something true about identity everywhere, not just in German-speaking Europe. Human naming systems were never designed as neutral, accurate records of ancestry. They were designed by people for practical medieval reasons: taxation, identification, reputation, theater, and only afterward did they calcify into what looks, centuries later, like inherited truth. A name that sounds like royalty may encode nothing more than a grandfather 300 years removed who managed a nobleman's stables. And that is not a lesser story. In some ways, it is a richer one, because it replaces a fantasy of borrowed blood with the traceable outline of a real working life. Picture the kind of place where a name like Voigt or Schultheiss would have been assigned. Not a throne room. A market square in a river valley town, timber-framed houses leaning toward each other over a muddy street, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys at once. A man standing at the town's edge with a ledger, collecting grain tithes on behalf of an authority who might never once set foot in that valley. Geese moving through the square. Church bells marking the hour. That man's entire social position, his access, his authority, his reputation, depended on his closeness to a distant power he served but did not possess. When his sons inherited his name, they inherited that same relationship, near the center but never at it. That is what these 12 surnames actually preserve. Not a crown. A position, close enough to power to be permanently shaped by it, far enough from power to remain generation after generation, ordinary people doing extraordinary institutional work. The old story promised something simple and flattering: a name, a title, a hidden royal thread waiting to be discovered. The evidence tells a story that is smaller in one sense and larger in another. Smaller, because almost none of these families were secretly emperors. Larger, because what they actually were, the administrators, stewards, magistrates, and estate officials who made a sprawling, fractured empire functionally governable for nearly 1,000 years, turns out to be a more consequential kind of history than borrowed royalty ever was. The map is not finished. Surname studies remain probabilistic, not absolute, and any individual family's true origin still requires its own documentary and genetic evidence before firm conclusions are drawn. But the outline is now visible enough to say this with confidence. These names were never really about blood running through a throne. They were about people standing close enough to history to be marked by it permanently, and distant enough from it to be forgotten by everyone except their own descendants, and the records that, centuries later, finally learned how to read them.